Welcome to Season 2 of The Strain Podcast, a South Media Group production, where we talk all about Guillermo del Toro's horror fantasy series, The Strain. We are currently covering the series' second season on FX. I'm your host, Blaire Knight Graves, Director of Social Media and Associate Editor from TVBinges.com, and with me today is Kyle Tremblay, the Editor-in-Chief at TVBinges.com. You can find us on Twitter at BlairLovesTV and at KyleLovesTV. Remember, both Kyle and Blaire have an E at the end. And you can follow this podcast's Twitter handle at @TheStrainPod, as well as going onto our Facebook page, The Strain Podcast on Facebook, facebook.com/The Strain Podcast. Hi, Kyle. How you doing today?
Oh, Blaire, we have quite an episode to talk about tonight, and before we start, I'd just like to make an official request that you refer to me only as the Night Demon of San Diego, or as the Barbarian Warrior. One of the two, please. Thank you.
The Barbarian Podcaster? How about that?
Barbarian Podcaster? That might be like the name of a real podcast.
That's actually entirely... It's a Dungeons & Dragons podcast.
Oh my god, we're already getting into Dungeons & Dragons.
What else would you expect, Kyle?
I'm rolling all 20s tonight. Is that a thing? Is that something?
Rolling D20s. Yeah, okay.
Yep. Goodbye, listeners.
Thanks so much for tuning in.
And we'll see you next week.
Today, Kyle, you and I are going to be discussing Season 2, Episode 7, titled The Bourne, and it was written by Chuck Hogan, who, of course, has written our favorite episode, which was Creatures of the Night in Season 1, which this was a full circle from Creatures of the Night, this episode, with the whole Nikki subplot with Dutch Velders. And Chuck Hogan is, of course, he worked with Guillermo del Toro to create the book series, as well as write on the comic books and be a staff writer for the TV show.
Yeah.
Oh.
This was... this episode, to call it a roller coaster, I don't think does justice to it.
Oh.
This episode, for me, wasn't just bonkers, it was cuckoo bananas. This was a series of 180-degree turns, tonally, quality-wise. My head is still spinning. It's been about an hour since it ended. My head is still spinning. I don't know what to make of it, so I'm glad we have the opportunity to talk it out.
I am as well. I would like to let our listeners know really quickly that at the end of this episode, we have a very special interview.
Yeah, we're talking to people now.
We are.
Besides ourselves.
Exactly. People want to have conversations with us. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, important people, actually.
Yeah, actually. So the individual at the end of this episode, you can check out the interview, is with Paul Clark. He's the CEO of Curate Health. I want to make sure I say that correctly.
I hope so. He is someone who consults with the CDC in real life, not in Strain life. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that Blaire and I have had a lot of questions about the way that the government is handling this crisis on the strain. And so he gave us some really cool perspective on pandemics in general and on specifically what our real government might do if there was an outbreak of a vampire virus.
So you guys should all stay tuned for that interview. It is super awesome. We had a really fun time doing it. And we would love to hear your feedback.
Yeah. But on to this episode, because holy cow.
On to the Bourne.
Yeah. Now, is this the Bourne Ultimatum? Where are we in F's Bourne series?
The Bourne Blade, I think, is where we are.
Yes. That was a popular observation on Twitter, that we have now entered a Blade movie. I am still writing for... we are now in a James Bond movie, full on. I mean, F now is indistinguishable from James Bond. So I mean, just a lot is going on right now. A whole lot is going on.
A lot of things, some of which were really exciting, and some things which were...
catastrophic.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Would you like to start with the good or the bad, Kyle?
You know what? I'm committed to positivity.
All right.
In fact, someone emailed this week, or no, someone posted on our Facebook page, like us on Facebook, by the way, The Strain Podcast, that they thought I was being too nice, which is literally the first time anybody has ever said that to me as it relates to TV. Normally everyone thinks I'm the mean, cranky guy, but I am starting with positivity this week.
Well, hey, I like that.
Let's talk about Quinlan.
Quinlan, the opening, the Bourne, the Demon Knight of Sicily.
Yes, my brother in Demon Knighthood.
I loved it.
Yeah.
It was a very condensed version of his story, but like it was again for our listeners who are unaware.
Sure.
I've read the books, and Kyle has only read the first. He reads every book after each season, and I've read them before him. It's a very condensed version of his story, but it is so much more interesting than the way they do it in the book. Because well, it's just the way they do it in the book is a whole like really long chapter, and it's really good, but there's just like low points, and it's like, and then he went from this civilization to this civilization, and like you kind of like learn about him as he like develops through time. So kind of just learning right off the bat that he was a warrior in Roman era, and then kind of bringing him into modern era and not really dealing with the in-between except for one little extra scene, I think was a good choice.
Right. Well, here we got Quinlan as Russell Crowe in Gladiator. So that was good. We just opened with it right off the bat.
Right.
We opened in Gladiator. So, quite an opening.
Yes. For what I can only assume is Julius Caesar, because that's all that I can reference.
Yeah.
In Roman times, I'm sure it's not. But like, very fascinating, very good. The start with that brutal kill is really interesting to see on FX. FX is like really going out of their way to be really gross. This episode was gross.
It was gross.
In good ways, I thought.
Well, it was gross in a couple different ways.
Yes.
Some of which were good.
There was one that was exceedingly gross that we'll talk about later. In not a good way.
I assume you're talking about Palmer.
That's me gagging, everybody. Just,
yeah, good sound effects. Good sound effects.
Yes. Got to add sound effects to the podcast. Yeah. But no, I really liked the intro, the way that he's talking with his senator, his sponsor, the senator, and he says, you bleed white, but you can walk in the sun. It's like perfect. It's like, okay, we get it. Like Brett's perfectly composed dialogue. We understand who he is, what he does, what he can do. Still confused as to why he needs day people from last episode. Mm-hmm. But yes, great introduction to Quinlan. He was a total badass, with the exception of throwing a styrofoam rock later in the episode.
Yeah. Some of the set work, both in this flashback scene and later on, was a little bit spotty, but we'll carry on.
Well, hey, they had to have budget for his awesome neck makeup thing.
It was pretty good makeup. I should say that we've referred to the now former body of the Master as a frog monster multiple times. So, got to give credit where credit is due. I really like Quinlan's makeup, and I really like Bolivar as the Master's makeup too.
I do too.
I dig that whole. I really like that whole scene up until the end of it, but we'll talk about that later. I think one of the key things to point out, because I think I made a comment a couple episodes back that the flashbacks are about 0 for 75 on the strain, which isn't accurate. They've had some good flashbacks in the past. They're like, realistically, they're probably like 6 for 30 in the flashbacks, but this was in the positive column. And it's because the best way to use flashbacks is to introduce a character that we want to get to know. One of the problems with these Abe flashbacks, which thankfully haven't happened for a little while now, is that we already know who Abe is. And so we don't need that extra information about him. Like, it might be nice, but the material itself is pretty boring and doesn't seem worthwhile outside of just informing us about Abe. And Abe is a character we already know and who we already have a bunch of points of reference for, and we don't need any more of that. But for Quinlan, this mystery guy who was introduced a couple episodes back and we know nothing about except that he carries a bone sword, and there was some fun with the hashtag.
He has a real bone sword.
Yeah. I'm going to leave that one alone. Getting to know about him right now seems like the right thing to do. It's like, that's a worthy goal, because that helps fill in some gaps on the character. Like, why is he walking during the day? And what's his deal? Like, that's what flashbacks can do. They can fill in sort of basic questions. And so seeing that he was a Roman gladiator who has existed throughout the centuries, and that he's the child of both a Strigoi and a human, is really interesting and very important for us to understand who that character is. So
my microphone became on.
Oh,
cut it back.
We lost Blaire. Are you under attack? Is this Creatures of the Night?
This is Creatures of the Night. I'm under attack. They're taking my microphone. They don't want me to get the message out.
Oh no! I'll start writing one-liners.
I'm back.
Okay, you're back.
My apologies to our audience.
I'm not editing that, so my apologies.
Oh, good. No, I thought it was very effective too. The one thing that I had an observation, which is what I've been thinking about. with these flashbacks, which is like, I think Quinlan being this Roman pit fighter of Quinlan, being the only successful one so far, is last season we had victims. If you recall, like, Ansel is the one that I always remember because he was my favorite from the book. We had victims from the plane, and we watched their stories, and they were sort of our little D story. That's what I would call that, maybe a C or a D story.
Sure.
To give us more information on what's going on. So they ran out of victims to follow, so they had to come up with something different to be the D story this season, and they decided that it would be the background of Abe, which is incredibly ineffective. Nobody bought it. We all know how it ended up. The only question I have is, when did Palmer, suddenly be able to walk?
Right.
Other than that, I liked seeing his wife's stuff. That was good when we showed Abe and his wife, and that's the heart. But that was from last season too, so that was a different version of the backstory. Mm-hmm. I felt like with this Quinlan stuff, there are other ways that you can have a D story. We could have, not that we necessarily would have wanted to, but we could have gone back and seen, F's alcoholism while he was with Kelly and Zach. We could go back and do a flashback about that, and like as a compare and contrast of his alcoholism, or any other character. We could revisit things from their past, or we could find modern day stories of other people who are having weird things happen to them. But instead, we did 6 episodes of flashbacks about Abe and Palmer, and it was just very ineffective, very boring. We know the end result. We're trying to learn about the oxidolumin, but we don't really need to learn about the oxidolumin. So
I still don't know what it is, by the way.
You don't?
I genuinely do not know what it is, other than it's a book. But like its significance, all of that, I just have not picked up on at all.
Should I educate you right now, or
no? I prefer being ignorant because I don't care about the tuxedo ramen. Okay. I just don't care. To me, that's like a little sort of fantasy sci-fi plot device. It's just like, oh, we need to get this book. Like, okay, great, guys.
Which is very confusing because somehow Abe has a storybook that has the story of Quinlan, which, in my recollection, is written in the oxidolumin in the books.
Yeah, what is that? What is Abe reading from?
I don't know.
Had that been introduced prior? Like, is this part of his like collection writings on Quinlan?
Well, like they had like the Scooby Gang scene where everybody was going through books earlier this season, so he has books with information on them. Right. But like that seems like information that he would have had memorized. Like if he knew that there was a Bourne out there and it was in one of his crazy books, he would have been like, yeah, I know about that, instead of, oh, I should go and consult my books.
I should go look it up, yeah.
Right, you're almost 100 years old. You've had time to read those things.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Which actually, it's very interesting that he was reading with Zach, because I have no idea why he was reading with Zach, except trying to make Zach more likable.
I actually, that was about one complaint with the first scene, is I don't think they needed that conceit. That he was reading it to Zach. I don't think that scene should have had any narration. I think that should have been... Because to me, a scene like that is so much more effective if it's a real flashback as opposed to like a dramatization of the story that Abe is reading. I don't know why that existed. I liked... I don't like boxing it in another story. I would just have kind of liked to have started in that time and written the dialogue in such a way that whatever information Abe was passing off came out anyway. And just kind of went from there. Because I guess I like having my cage rattled a bit. And when you start with Abe's voice as a voiceover, it's sort of a little bit too comforting for me. I kind of like when the strain gets a little more daring and edgy and intentionally does things to throw viewers off. You don't
like Walder Frey reading you a bed story?
Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the problem here. Is that I hear that voice and I think, oh my gosh, Red Wedding, it's coming. He's launching a surprise attack.
Yes, that's just what we always have to worry about with the strain, is that that Walder Frey will hit us with the Red Wedding.
Yes, it's a constant fear. I'm still not 100% sure that Abe is working for the good guys. He could turn double agent anytime, but that's exclusively because he's Walder Frey.
I mean, he did have a tag team match against the Master, so...
Well, he was supposed to. That scene. Talk about, like, building up a lot of promise and then everything just sort of dying out like a slowly deflating balloon. Like, Are you kidding me? You're going to tease us with a tag team Quinlan and Abe versus the Master and Eichhorst? Eichhorst, by the way, no lines in this episode, just shows up like a hype man to come in and like stalk around and look menacing. Like I thought he was going to bust a verse right there. Like him and Bolivar were basically like in a rap video there, and they were squaring off, and I was like so psyched. And then, of course, this ridiculous plan that had a 0% chance of working to cave in the building. Why not just fight him? Why not just play the fight? Like, it's so frustrating that scene happened.
They're trying to indicate, I think, that Fett is only good for one thing because he feels incompetent this episode.
Oh,
so, like,
does he ever?
They are just trying to make him as flaccid as possible.
Given his current relationship status with Dutch, that is an appropriate word choice.
Thank you very much.
Fett.
We should probably just talk about that now.
Has a character who was previously really cool ever had a worse episode of television?
Oh, did you hate it that much?
I mean, well, I'm speaking sort of from his in-world perspective. Like, I'm not necessarily quibbling with. Well, yes, I am. Okay, I am. I'm walking back my own statement. I both hate it in-world and from a critical sort of meta perspective. Because, First of all, Fett this whole time has been the totally cool, completely badass, borderline insane rat catcher turned vampire exterminator. In this episode, he is the dumped high school nerd who's listening to the Smiths and crying in his room and putting on eyeliner. Like, I've never seen a dude turn emo so fast.
Sure he's not listening to Bolivar?
Well, yeah, he's listening to Bolivar.
In-world, man, in-world.
Yeah, in-world, right, Bolivar. What if Bolivar is in the Smiths in this world?
It's more likely to be a member of The Cure.
Okay, yeah. Well, listen, you know the emo stuff.
It's not emo. Don't you dare. All right, we're not going to do that now.
Is this a good time to ring up Pacific Rim? Should I just defend all your sensibilities?
All right, now we're going to square off. I have Eichhorst on my team. You have Abe.
By the way, did you know our Week Talk Army member Laura Lee told me this week? Did you know that the actor who played the Master, the giant actor, was in Pacific Rim?
I didn't know that. Who was?
I was so excited. He was one of the Russian.
I was gonna say, is he one of the Russian guys?
Yeah, he was the big Russian guy who piloted the Jaeger. So excited. Gives me an excuse to watch the movie again.
Well, we know that Guillermo del Toro likes to use the same people. I think that Ron Perlman has been in almost everything since, not since Hellboy. Hellboy's the movie he gave to him. It was his vampire movie that he did in the 90s. I can't remember what it's called. But Guillermo del Toro, Ron Perlman was in a vampire movie that Guillermo del Toro did in the 90s.
Well, in general, if you can put Ron Perlman in something, you put Ron Perlman in something.
Right, but Guillermo del Toro is the one who figured that out.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, and I think a lot of directors work that way.
Yeah.
You know, you have actors who you like and who you know what to do with. And
well, yeah, there was a bunch of actors from Pacific Rim were also other vampires in the strain. I remember from season 1 there was a little girl who was in the strain, and he reuses his people.
Just another reason why Pacific Rim is the best. Anyway, on to Fett. So, I mean, I'm just saying, like, couldn't he have been a little bit cooler about this whole thing? Like, are we supposed to believe that he's, like, in love with Dutch? Because I didn't get that at all. It seems like their relationship is largely physical. Like, mostly physical.
But she is portrayed as this wild vixen, and he is portrayed as this, like, moon-eyed dweeb, right? Like, again, we got his pants came back this episode. His, like, pants that are way too big for him, and he puts the belt up above his belly button. He's a huge dweeb. They make him to be the biggest dweeb. So like,
but
he's like
also
a heartbroken dweeb. Like he's not.
You can't compartmentalize that and the fact that he's also the most effective killer of vampires they have, other than possibly Abe. Like he can't be the dweeb and the guy who walks into a construction site is like, "Yo boys, I'm blowing this place up."
Right.
Like he that's not compatible. He can't be both characters. He's one or the other. Those aren't two sides of a compatible personality. He's either the sort of shy dweeb who's never had a relationship, or he's the Sylvester Stallone in Rambo character. But he can't be both.
I don't want to get into...
A scene like this, to me, crosses that line where they're playing too hard on the dweeb part of his personality and they're not factoring in everything else we've seen from him.
I agree, but also... Like, maybe that's just because that's a character stereotype we're used to seeing in television and film, is that you are either fully hard or you are fully soft. You can't be anywhere in between.
Well, listen, if you're with Dutch Velders, you're... Never mind. Let's keep going.
I accidentally gave that to you. But, like, there aren't a lot of characters in television that are somewhere, like, they've got their mushy, their mushy lovey stuff, but then they're also really hard and bruised and battered and all that. So, like, what if he is that rare character that we get in the middle? Because that's sort of how I thought that it's not necessarily the direction that I would write Fett, because Fett does not have Dutch in the books,
Sure.
so I don't know how he would act with her romantically. But I found that to be kind of believable, that he's really good at his job, he's really hardened, he hasn't had a lot of relationships, and now he has one, and he wants to hold on to it. And I thought the dialogue was written pretty well, and I thought Kevin Durand gave a pretty good performance. I thought Dutch and Nikki were written terribly, but I thought...
Oh my gosh, Nikki.
I thought Fett is somebody who probably is a pretty jealous dude. I think Dutch was written the way that they said that they were going to write her, that, she specializes in passionate, destructive relationships.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just so obvious that this is who Dutch is, and also that it's not really her fault, because she thought Nikki was dead. Like, this is a very Walking Dead situation with Rick, Lori, and Nick, I think is the name of of Rick's best friend, who assumed he was dead, so
it's
he got
not Rick and Nick.
Well, you're right, it's not. They wouldn't have done that. What's his name? The season 1, season 2.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, the guy who by the end of his run on the show was just talking in like grunts and growls. Our fans are dying right now because everyone knows his name. I'm gonna look it up on IMDb, but I'll keep talking.
I am too. You keep talking.
Okay. I guess to me, Fett's reaction was over the top jealous. Like he I think he's a cool enough customer that he wouldn't just let it be so obvious, because he was basically behaving like Zach in this episode. Like, the whining was on par with what Zach normally operates at.
You think that's how Fett was?
Yeah, I think he was whining. He was whiny. He was not acting like someone who's in control of his emotions or has any kind of empathy for the situation that, his I guess girlfriend is in now.
Right.
Which is that she did not know this person was alive. It wasn't like she was hiding Nikki from Fett.
Right.
She assumed Nikki was dead, and Nikki also stole from her. And so, it's sort of like they discover her in a very, like, surprise situation. They weren't going in to rescue her. And it's like, can't you have a little bit of, like, it's like, oh, well, this is awkward. Maybe I should cut it some slack, considering that we've only been together for, I mean, how long have Fett and Dutch been together now? In
2 or
the
3
shows?
weeks,
2 or 3 weeks? Like, this isn't like a soulmate situation.
Right.
Like, I don't know, he was so whiny. He was so, like subtweeting, he was such a little whiny, snot-nosed kid in that scene that it's not my image of who Fett is,
right,
to act like that. And it didn't help that the Dutch and Nikki conversations were written like a high school play, which contributed to the feeling that this was all high school.
Yes.
And that the Nikki character does not need to exist in any universe.
No.
I do not know why she's back, other than to backstab everyone, because she's obviously not a good guy.
Oh, that's what I think too.
Obviously.
The character you're looking for from The Walking Dead, by the way, is named Shane, not Nick.
Shane!
Because Nick and Rick would be the worst thing that has ever happened on television.
I wouldn't put it past The Walking Dead.
Shane is the gentleman that you're referencing.
Oh, Shane. So yeah, but this is the same situation, right? Where takes the guy's wife because he thinks he's dead, comes back, blah blah blah.
I think that the part where they kind of messed up a little bit with the Fett thing, and messed up with the Dutch thing is, or maybe it was correct, is that the moment that she sees Nikki, she goes and kisses her and embraces her and is so happy to see her, right when she's coming off of the arms of Fett. I think that's the part that Fett has the visceral reaction to, and that just puts him in a mood.
But it's not. But it continues, and he just gets worse. Like he in that scene where he's like talking about it to Abe, and Abe basically tells him to shut up, nobody cares. I feel like that was what I was thinking. It's like, nobody cares, man. Like you've met this girl for 2 to 3 weeks. You know exactly who she is. Like, it's not a secret who Dutch is, and maybe they've had a connection, but also that connection isn't severed just because her old girlfriend showed up. I mean, play your cards right, buddy. Right. This is an opportunity.
Right, but I agree, though. He has to give her time to figure out what she wants out of all of this.
But if he had been, like, if this was F, for example, and you sort of messed with the characters in such a way that F was in a similar spot, I would buy F behaving like this. Because I don't think that the problem is that I don't like how he's behaving. It's that I don't believe that Fett would behave like this at all. I just don't. I don't buy. We've seen that character now for 20-some episodes. I don't have any. I've never gotten any sense that this is who that character is at all. I like the petty, jealous lover. I just don't. That's not part of that character's profile, and I frankly I reject it. I don't buy that for Fett at all, and that's why this material didn't work for me.
Interesting. That's a very, very, standing your ground way to express how you feel about that.
Well, maybe the problem is I should buy in more to the Fett-Dutch relationship. Because maybe if I sort of bought them as star-crossed lovers, which I didn't even know they were being sold as, but if the show thinks that we think they're in love, then I'd buy it a little more.
They've only shown them get frisky in dangerous situations. They get off on the danger,
right,
that type of thing.
And their entire relationship is basically 3 sex scenes. The pool scene, the van scene, and then the start of this episode.
And the van scene was not romantic.
No, right, but that was like there was like an emotional tone to that scene that wasn't present in the other scenes. Right. But I guess I didn't realize how seriously the show wanted us to take that relationship, I think is my problem.
Yeah,
I did not even understand that they wanted us to believe like we're supposed to be shipping them.
Right.
Because if that's the case, then it makes a little bit more sense. Then I can kind of buy that he's this spurned lover. But to me, it's just like the girl he's hooking up with now has her other girlfriend, and he should be trying to angle to get in on that action. Come on, Fett!
I guess
not.
I guess for me, and this is like mild book reader thing.
Yeah.
He does have a romantic relationship in the book series, and this is in line with his behavior with the romantic relationship he has in the books.
Okay.
Which is not Dutch. Dutch is a completely fabricated character for the TV show.
Is it the receptionist of his old work? Is that a character in the books?
Do you want me to tell you? That's like a huge spoiler that I don't feel like...
Well, I read the first book, so I just remember them having something going on.
Yeah. There was chemistry, but like that would be a huge spoiler that I cannot give to our fans.
Okay.
And I will not say whether or not the character has been introduced.
Ooh.
So for me, watching him behave that way, it was weird watching him behave that way over Dutch for me.
Yeah.
But that's totally within his behavior scheme to me.
They should have given him a more realistic partner. Like, the Dutch character is such a miss. And I know she's had moments this season. She's been better overall this season than the last season. But there's too many scenes like the ones with her and Nikki where it feels like two fake people talking about fake things.
Right.
And that's the problem.
That Nikki character was written atrociously this episode.
It was
like,
horrible.
if
really
she's
bad.
not like a government plant or like a Stoneheart plant or something like that, if she's not that, then I don't really it's just like a huge misstep. Like a shot in the dark for the series to bring her back. I don't know what they're trying to do emotionally for us with Dutch, but the only realistic reason that they would bring her back is government, Stoneheart, master, whatever it is. She has to be a plant. She has to have come from somewhere and working as an enemy agent because she stole all of Dutch's money and she stole her hard drives and did a bunch of terrible things to her. And if Dutch can just forgive that blindly, A, that's weird. B, it's just like she did all that stuff almost certainly with purpose, right? Like almost certainly because Stoneheart even hired Dutch in the first place, so they would have access to Nikki.
Correct, that's a good point. For the sake of the show and its tenuous storytelling, I really hope she's a Stoneheart plant. Because that would at least justify the character.
Mm-hmm.
If this is a straightforward case like the F's friend who got shot last week, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
If this is Rob, where we all thought he was a bad guy, but then he's just the dude who gets shot, like, that's going to be a huge problem.
They can't tell that story again.
Yeah, right. They can't have it again. And also, like, that's not... You can't bring Nikki back just to kill her. You bring her back to expose Dutch's naivety, I guess, and then to kill her. That's right. What has to happen. You know, she has to turn, get someone in trouble, and then eventually die. And then at least the character makes sense, like, storytelling-wise. Otherwise, it's really just wasted screen time.
Waste.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Everything you were saying before, though, I'm starting to see the light. That this all hinges on the belief that Fett and Dutch even had a romantic relationship.
Yeah, but if you buy into that, I can see your side of it. Like that's sort of the price of admission. And I'm always the one saying you buy into the premise. I just didn't know that's what the premise was. I don't think the show has made clear that we're supposed to buy into Fett and Dutch being like the anchor of this show, the Jim and Pam of this show.
Well, because it wasn't working with Nora and F, so they had to try somewhere else.
Yeah, we've talked about it. I just didn't realize like how serious it was. Like I don't know, it never really clicked to me like that was supposed to be like this like real big deal. Like so it's like okay, well I guess I have to adjust my expectations accordingly.
Yeah, the only thing that I can think of with this whole Dutch subplot, and I almost certainly believe that Dutch is going to die this season.
Interesting.
Yeah, I just don't think that there's use for her soon. Like
there's much more use for killing her in service of Fett.
Yeah, well, she's a good sacrificial lamb.
Yeah.
She's a good, like, I'll stay and fight the good fight while you guys escape. She's a good character for that. I don't know if she's a good, like, final battle character.
No, she's a perfect character to kill because she's not a good character, but she's a character we've spent a lot of time with.
Right, and she's, like, going to redeem herself in some way, right? She's going to do something bad to Fett and redeem herself in some way, and then she will die a hero.
Well, maybe the Nikki story is the beginning of that. Where Nikki's going to sell out the team, and Dutch will have to sacrifice herself in order to get them out of whatever pickle Nikki gets them into.
Exactly, that's what I think.
That would make a lot of sense. I'll co-sign that.
But then I think that all of that is a setup for Fett's future romantic relationship. Like, I think that in the books, his romantic relationship is the sloppiest introduction to a romantic relationship I've ever read. So I think it's like a setup. It's like let him get his heart broken and let him like fall into the arms of someone else.
Okay,
so
well, interesting. We'll keep an eye on that then.
That's what I think.
Because if there's one thing this show's about, it's romantic entanglements.
It's trying. It tries.
It certainly thinks it is.
With Coco and Palmer.
Oh my god. I threw up in my mouth.
Literally all of Twitter. Just no.
Okay. Let's brace ourselves because we're going to talk about this now. I'm going to try not to think directly about it, but I'm going to have to talk about it.
You want to get the image out of your head while you talk about it?
I think there's only one question that needs to be asked here.
Okay.
What does the strain think it's doing? What? Forget about what's happening. We all know what's happening. Our listeners know what's happening. What's happening is a nightmare. A nightmare greater than any vampire could bring. What does the strain think it's doing?
The only two acceptable answers to this are, one, a terrible representation of a female character who wants to get into bed with a rich man because he's old and dying.
Yes.
I find that kind of that's a horrible thing to write for a female character, but that's one of the only two that I will accept. And the other one is that Coco Marchand has worked for the Ancients the entire time. Correct. And she's got to get into bed with Palmer to get security access and then destroy him.
Yes. So three options here. Coco is face value, which is a professional who sort of sees an opportunity in this, but is also weirdly attracted to Palmer for real, and is sort of doing a mix of falling in love and sleeping her way to the top, which again is a nightmare to create a female character for that purpose. If that's the case, then the strain should win the opposite of an Emmy. The strain should win a Razzie.
Yeah, then they would be just proving to us that they're terrible, the diversity on the show.
There is also a possibility that Coco is playing him false, that her affection for him is completely made up, and that she is just sleeping her way to the top. That she does not have any affection for him, and that she is while not working for anybody other than herself, coming up with a way to sort of become more powerful selfishly.
And survive what's happening.
And survive,
yeah.
and that is about 40% more acceptable than the previous scenario.
Okay.
The only way in which this is even remotely justifiable is if she is a double agent working for the Ancients or the Master, and the Master, because remember, the Master has not been cool with Palmer this season. They have a very strained relationship, no pun intended. What if Ikehurst, for example, it would be the Ikehurst, not the Master directly, but what if Ikehurst reached out to her, and instead of remember, because Bolivar was babysitting Palmer for a while, what if instead of Bolivar, he has inserted Coco
right.
is his agent, and she is working on Ikehurst's behalf as a way to eventually kill Palmer, basically.
Right, attractive female who he would be duped by, as opposed to scary rockstar vampire.
Exactly, and if the strain is doing that, then it's still gross, but the story makes sense.
Right. But either of the former options.
Horrible
way to write a woman. Like,
and if it's the latter option, we should have been let in on that. That should not be a reveal. That should, because I think the rule for shows is if keeping a secret from the audience is unbearably unpleasant for the audience, then that secret isn't worth keeping.
Right.
And so we should have, because how different would these scenes be if Coco's introduction was a scene with Ikehurst, like a 30-second scene with Ikehurst, where he's talking to her about something mysterious and we don't really know what's going on, and then at the end of the episode she shows up all smiles talking to Palmer and he falls for it hook, line, and sinker. That whole storyline would be cast in a very different light if we knew that she was an agent for someone else.
I will disagree slightly and say that if in the next episode, and only if in the next episode, they reveal it, then I will consider that acceptable. If they wait until the end of the season, I will not find that acceptable.
How many episodes have we complained about? This is like 4 episodes now of this slow-burning romance. To me, one of the things I hate most is when TV retroactively justifies itself. It's this stupid line of thinking that is like, okay, well, this is terrible, but let's wait for the end. And this is the complementary line of thinking of, this is great, but if the end is bad, then the whole thing is terrible. It's like, no, the end is no more or less important than any point in the middle. And right now, this is terrible. No one could possibly make a case that this is not terrible. Just because retroactively we find out that it had purpose doesn't make it any less terrible. It just makes it from that point forward not terrible anymore. But that point should have come way earlier so that it would have been not terrible this whole time. That's my case.
No, that's fair. That's a good case to make.
This drives me nuts as a TV critic. The show's asking us to endure horrible material for some kind of payoff that may or may not be effective. It's like, if you can make the material not horrible, how about that? Hey, how about that? Just don't make the material horrible. Like, this material, there's no way they watched this material in the editing bay and it was like, oh yeah, we got it. It's like, no, this is terrible. I mean, this is universally 100%. It's a certainty that this is terrible. Everyone knows this is terrible. So their only possible line of thinking is that this is all going to be made worth it by some reveal they're saving up. It's like, well, if that's the case, reveal it right off the bat, and then it's not terrible.
Is it terrible because it's an older man with a younger woman, or is it terrible because it's written, dialogue is bad? Just define terrible.
A 90-year-old with a 25-year-old, which is not an older man with a younger woman. It's a decrepit old man with a very young, attractive woman. And then also because it doesn't have clear intentionality. As in, I don't know why it exists, because at face value, it's a romantic story. It's being played on the show right now in this episode as a romance and nothing else. There's no seasoning. There's no twinge to that. It is a romance story between one of our chief villains and a woman who was introduced earlier this season. That's it. There's no layer to it. Right now, at this present time, that's all it is. It's a series of romance scenes with the villain. Yeah. For reasons that are completely unclear why we're watching it. Like, why are we watching one of the chief villains of the show fall in love? What is that? What does that get you, storytelling wise?
Yeah, I want to intervene with something from the books, but I can't.
Okay.
I think, I think she's being set up to make. I think, I guess there's a fourth option now that I'm thinking about it, that she's being used to make Palmer more sympathetic.
But
it's not working.
I mean, not only is it not working, it's not even in the ballpark of working. Like,
right,
it's not close.
It makes him more vile, in my opinion.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's why. Again, this is the casting thing. The actress is fine. I have no issue with Coco Marchand as a performance. Why not hire someone who's like in their 50s?
That's what I was just gonna say.
Why not? Why isn't Dutch a mousy receptionist type like Pam or something? Who's like very attractive but not like. Not a supermodel blonde. Like, this is the Strain makes these ridiculous casting choices of overly attractive blondes for roles that do not require that.
Yeah, but I would like to say, by that same token, Justine Feraldo and Lee from last episode both are attractive women, but they're not bombshell women. And
yes, right, that's what I mean. Yeah.
So like they have these like important women in the show, but if it's going to be a main cast member, they've got or a romance, they have to be like, supermodel attractive, and it's a very strange casting choice. I liked Lee a lot, and I liked Justine Feraldo a lot. I think that they act like I think that they were the right choices for those roles, and I think Coco Marchand would have been more appropriate, like a Lee character.
But if Coco Marchand is a double agent, then the casting makes sense.
Right.
See, that's sort of why I'm saying like that's the only storytelling route that makes sense here, because suddenly her being a very attractive 25-year-old blonde makes sense, because that's the kind of bait that you would use if you're Eichhurst. You wouldn't put in someone who's more age appropriate for Palmer. So to me that's part of this story. That's why they better be telling this story, because if they're not, then it makes even less sense than it does now.
Yeah. All right, I agree, but this is one of those things where I don't understand why people think you're nice.
Yeah. Well, again, I thought there were some great aspects of this episode. I thought I was really frustrated with elements of this episode. Like, I don't think this was that good of an episode, to be honest. But
Weird.
There were some great parts of it. Like the Quinlan stuff was like great. Yeah.
I would like to say, I tweeted this earlier.
Yeah.
With the exception, of course, of the pilot.
Yeah.
I think that the first 23 minutes of this episode was the most effective television the show's ever written.
Sum up for me what happened in the first 23 minutes, because there's some important lines I need to draw.
Okay. In the first 23 minutes...
Quinlan. Introduction of Quinlan, we talked about.
Introduction of Quinlan. You get the Fett and Dutch stuff right off the bat, which I thought was kind of fine. Actually,
it got worse as it went.
Right. They get to the apartment, and then that's when they meet Nikki. That's when I think the episode started being low quality. Like up until that point, like even the first moment where you meet Nikki, I thought was really effectively done.
That's fine.
It was very effectively done. And then you had F immediately going for a bar, drinking, getting his...
Of course. Always a winner.
And then I think that's it. So those were the first 23 minutes. And for me, that was like just like cinematically and like the tone and the rhythm of the entire episode. It was just the best 23 produced minutes that the show's ever done, because I just felt like, oh, I know where we're going. I understand who we're with. I understand their motivations. I get that dialogue. Like often I'm confused by what on earth is happening and like why they choose to go somewhere or why they choose to do something or act away or all that stuff. This was just like, oh, these are very good conclusions to come to from the material that we just referenced. And it felt seamless to me. Like, oh, this feels like a real thing that F would do. Instead, because you're talking about like things like Fett doesn't feel like the right, like you don't buy into the new element of his character that they've introduced, which is that obscenely jealous element. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, I think being a badass probably does come with jealousy, because then you're hot-headed, right? But
this is the guy who says boom boom before he blows things up.
He didn't boom boom this time.
He didn't boom boom. He just simply told the construction workers that he was blowing it up.
Yes. But yeah, so I felt like I knew these characters and I believed every single thing that they were doing, and that's why I thought it was effective.
I don't disagree with any of that, and I think that's a great case. And I think the first 23 minutes of this episode, I'm not sure if I'm ready to co-sign that it was the best, but it was very good. I thought this episode started great, and especially the Quinlan stuff was really, really good. My problems with the episode summarized are that the Quinlan Abe partnership dissolved so fast and over something so stupid that was clearly a plot device in that the building blows up, blah blah blah, they escape, yada yada. Like we were robbed of what would have been an amazing fight scene, which sucks. But you know, I understand we can't have it mid-season and all that. But it just, if you set it up like that, and it was really exciting. I loved the idea that Quinlan respected Abe. Mm-hmm. That was really cool to me, that he had like known who he was, and even though he's this millennia old. Yeah, I was trying to hyphenate it with old. Very weird. Anyway, even though he's been around for thousands of years, he knows who Abe is and respects him and wants to work with him. But then for that relationship to come to such a quick end, it was a real bummer to me. I felt like that was a missed opportunity, because I love watching competent characters together, and it seems like Quinlan and Abe are two of the most competent.
I don't think it's going to end. I think Quinlan is just having a hissy fit.
Yeah, well, the first of many in this episode. but speaking of which, so I didn't like how that ended. I mean, I'm sure they'll get back together, whatever. But it was a bummer that it didn't end in a fight. And then of course Fett, the way he continued whining, like what I thought, and what would have been okay by me, is Fett reacted exactly how he did, but then when Abe tells him to shut up about his relationship, he drops it. And from that point on, we don't hear that much about it. Like, what I didn't need were like the 4 extra scenes of Fett whining and getting more whiny. That's what I didn't need. Give me that in the next episode, that's fine, but like spread it out a little more. This was too much Fett whining for me. And then the Palmer stuff was obviously a big problem. Yeah, but it's like, that's all told, that's half the episode. So
that is that's just fair.
I can't really like give this one my stamp of approval when I didn't like half the episode. But that half just happens to have all occurred in the second half.
Right.
So yeah.
No, I guess I can agree. I was less pleased as the episode went on, but going in, I was thrilled. I thought, wow, if this is the way that the strain is going to keep going, then I'm really excited, and I feel like this is a show that I'm actually, like, I do genuinely enjoy, but like I will unabashedly enjoy.
Yeah. I should point out one positive, which is that for once, Zach was not one of the 3 most annoying characters on screen.
Hey.
He made it wasn't that he wasn't annoying; he just wasn't one of the 3 most annoying.
Who were the 3 most annoying?
Fett 3 times. No. Fett, Palmer, Coco.
Interesting.
Are my 3.
I would have made Nikki.
Oh God, Nikki. Oh yeah, you're right. Nikki number 1.
I would have said Fett, Nikki, and Coco. Palmer didn't really annoy me, actually. Palmer did really good to stave that woman off for a little while. I was like, it's funny because her name is Coco. I want to say you go Glen Coco. Like a mighty you go Glen Coco to Palmer for trying to stop from being seduced.
Oh, he did go Glen Coco.
Yeah, he did. Oh, God.
No, you're right. That's a good list. The point is, there's a fierce battle for the 3 most annoying characters this episode, and Zach did not make it for once, so kudos to him.
Kudos to Zach. I thought F was incredibly effective in this episode. F
has been on fire.
Corey Stoll, like, take the wig off, and that man can act.
LL Cool Stoll, the man himself. I'm sure it helped your opinion that he was shirtless for half the season.
Oh man, he has been shirtless for 3 episodes in a row. Are you kidding me? I'm very happy.
Bald, shirtless Corey Stoll.
Yeah.
With a gunshot wound. Mm-hmm. Pouring whiskey on it and then taking a sip of the same whiskey.
He's drinking bourbon. That's my drink.
And so much bourbon.
All of the bourbon.
So much bourbon.
Which, by the way, bars are just open.
Yeah, cool. Walk in, vampires.
In another episode, like, they were going through the streets of Manhattan and they were like sneaking into like shut down bars, and then like he's in New York again and he walks into a bar, gets a drink with that. No big deal.
Can you tell me how he got back from DC to New York?
No idea.
Anybody?
No.
He couldn't have gotten on that government train because he has a gunshot wound.
He said it took him a couple of days. That line of dialogue was there.
Did he hitchhike?
I don't know, but like with a gunshot wound, he went a couple of days.
Yeah.
And it didn't look gnarly.
No.
Like, that looked like a fresh wound when they
I assume he treated it. I mean, he is a scientist, so maybe, and he seems to have tended to it. I don't know. That whole thing doesn't make sense, but it doesn't matter because as we've predicted for so long, and I'm so pleased that it's happened, as soon as Corey Stoll got rid of that wig, he became Corey Stoll again.
He did.
I mean, he is just, he's absolutely on fire. He's unstoppable. no plot inconsistencies can stop him now. It's just every moment he's on screen is great, which is such a turnaround from what that character has been for most of the series. It's just that's really, I think, if you're buying into the narrative that the Strain has undergone a turnaround this season, then that is the catalyzing event, the wig shaving. Unquestionably, that was it.
No, I mean, like, not just because of the ridiculousness of the wig, but also just it was just a wonderful moment in the television series as well. Like, it was I thought it was a well done scene. It was, giving up your former self to become something new to save the world. Like, it's that hero building moment where they put on the mask or something, like Batman puts on the mask, but Corey still shaves off the wig.
Yes. Absolutely.
But it is that gravitas hero moment, and it worked. The show has taken a turn since that happened. You're correct. It's much better now.
It is.
It is.
Do we want to get into our interview?
We should.
Let's do it.
So as we said, we are so excited to have Paul Clark with us. Go ahead and give a listen to the interview, and you can learn a little bit about pandemics as they would actually happen if the strain were real.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. We are thrilled to be joined by the CEO and founder of Curate Health, Paul Clark. Welcome to the Strain Podcast.
Thank you, Blaire. Thank you, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Paul, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Absolutely. Currently, Curate Health is involved in patient data analytics and healthcare research. And in my past, I've done all but doctorate at Johns Hopkins. So I've done all the coursework for a doctorate in public health at Johns Hopkins, and have a master's degree in bioethics and health policy from Loyola University Chicago, a master's in healthcare administration from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a master's in public administration with a focus on science and technology policy from George Mason University. So I have been quite obsessed with the public health infrastructure, healthcare administration, and the delivery of healthcare services for way too long.
That's all. I'm almost worried that someone with such qualifications actually listens to our podcast. But pressing forward, Paul, you sent us a great email this week with your thoughts on the strain. And when we saw your qualifications, we were like, oh man, we've got to have you on the podcast to talk about this very specific thing, which is that Blaire and I, since the podcast began, basically, since the strain began, have been obsessed with the way that the government on the strain is responding to what is essentially a public health crisis. As someone who is actually qualified to judge the response of the CDC, which is the main entity involved here, what are your thoughts in general on the way the CDC is portrayed on the strain?
Well, the strain has had some great hits on accuracy of the overall pandemic response, number one, and they've also had some misses. But I think it's important to start off with just first, like, what is a pandemic? What does that word mean? What are we talking about with this? And in public health, we define a pandemic disease as any global disease outbreak that occurs when a new virus emerges. So it has to be new. It spreads where people have no immunity. And it's a disease where there is no vaccine, spreads from person to person, causes serious illness, and has the potential to sweep around the world in a short period of time. So obviously, the strain and our little vamp worms have the qualifications to be a pandemic. But the reason why public health is so obsessed with pandemics is because it has such tremendous potential to create a great loss of life. And it's something that strikes with incredible regularity. So we can expect to have a global influenza pandemic. Now, that's just influenza every 10 to 40 years. And a global pandemic, if you want to think about what that looks like, you remember Ebola, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that was not even quite a true pandemic. That was on the verge of being a pandemic. In fact, all the viral outbreaks that have made the news over the past few years, Ebola, MERS, SARS, H5N1 in 2004, H1N1 in 2009, only H1N1 was a truly global pandemic. And coincidentally, though, each of those was associated with animals, particularly migratory fruit bats. And why we're obsessed with that, which I find those little coincidences fascinating when we talk about vamps and things like that. So when we talk about pandemics and what really scares the bejesus out of the public health folks, you look at when was the last time that we had pandemics. The 1918 and 1919 Spanish flu, that took off 50 million people off the globe. It killed 700,000 people in the United States, which was approximately 2.5% of the U.S. population.
Wow.
So just think about that. If the Spanish flu happened today, that would be the equivalent of having 7 9/11s every day for 365 days in a year. So it really, truly is a nightmare for public health professionals. And what makes us really scared about it, too, is if you think about how prepared are we as a nation, which gets into the portrayal of CDC, unfortunately, as a nation today, we are less prepared than we were 10 years ago. We had a big influx of federal funds in response to 9/11 and the threat or the perceived threat of bioterrorism. But after the economy in 07-08, we've seen federal funds for public health emergency preparedness reduced by $1 billion and nearly 50,000 jobs cut at the state and local public health departments. So we are woefully unprepared, and if folks want to look up any lectures by anybody to really dive deep into this, Dr. Michael Osterholm from the University of Minnesota is the world's foremost expert on this, and he will tell you that this is what keeps him up at night. This is what scares the hell out of him, to use his quote. So that's a little bit of a background, and I apologize if I went way too deep. But I think it's important to understand what the stakes are, and that's one thing where I think the strain is really missed on. If F. Goodweather had this sense of urgency that, say, Dr. Osterholm has from Minnesota, if he, was talking about this in terms of, the exponential rate of infection, how millions of lives are at stake, and that's what he did in this last show, and that's what got me really excited and finally compelled me to email you all, is because finally, he's starting to communicate the fact that it's not just a few folks in New York that are at risk, but this is the human race which is at risk,
right.
And that's what and that's really what Angel did well all the time. Just to drop a little Angel, is there was always the human race at risk.
Right. Thank you for bringing up Angel, because right pulls on my heartstrings.
This is my nightmare.
So we're in season 2 right now of The Strain, and it's halfway through the season, and F is finally having that reaction that you think that he should be having. How do you feel that the first responders reacted to the crisis, to the strain in season 1? So that's the airport personnel, calling of the CDC, the senators who were involved, all the government agents that were involved, or just public servants who were involved. How did they react according to your expertise in season 1?
Sure. In season 1, you could almost segment it first episode, first half, and last half. First episode was very accurate. And I think you could tell they really wanted to pay a lot of attention to detail to get the science right. You look at how they were putting up physical barriers, how they were isolating folks. And in fact, the only part of that that probably wasn't necessarily completely accurate, and this has sort of been all season long, is Barnes's conflict with F. You wouldn't necessarily see much conflict, and I think we recognize too as a television show that there would be way more doctors involved than portrayed, but the necessity of storytelling means that we filter down multiple characters, multiple people that would be involved into 1 or 2 characters for the purposes of a television show. But that was very accurate. You would isolate folks. You would have the medical equipment that they were doing and using. You would have the barriers, and you would have all those sorts of precautions taken on. What wasn't quite accurate was the morgue. The morgue was just that was just crazy time.
Airplane hangar.
Yeah, and well, they might use an airplane hangar. This is the thing that actually throughout season 1 and season 2, I think they could have done a better job doing is that. And Contagion is probably the most accurate portrayal of CDC protocols in a movie.
I love that movie.
And you saw it in that movie that they were just utilizing whatever sort of facilities that they had on hand. Because you don't want to be moving these bodies around, especially when you don't know all the factors of transmission and what could be happening. And you don't know even the illness that you're dealing with. You don't want to be moving them around. So it was actually okay to be using the airport hangar, but just having one dude there and no security whatsoever, and that one dude not having the same protective barriers that F and Nora had, that was just craziness.
That makes sense. I actually have a question on that first episode, just a little question. Because F is introduced to us long before he became James Bond, which he is now. He's introduced to us as the head of the Canary unit of the CDC, where it's he, Nora, and Jim are kind of like the people who go in first to these situations. And so when that plane gets brought down, and I think the assumption at the time is that this is a chemical event has occurred and killed everyone on board. And so F, Nora, and Jim are the three people who are sent in. Is that a real thing? And would that unit or whatever the real world equivalent be the first people to be on that plane?
The first people on that plane would most likely be the local CDC. Okay, so there's city and state and county departments of public health. All of those have sort of a matrix-like relationship up to the Department of Health and Human Services. The CDC is also part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And the CDC has many branches in many different places, many labs in many different places, because of the fact that this is a timely thing. You just can't have it, the plane sitting on the tarmac for 12 hours, especially because there could be alive people in there. They don't know. You would have the closest qualified CDC MD on there. So you wouldn't necessarily wait or fly in your golden child into the loop. But I ignored that just on the sake of, again, storytelling and character building. But technically, if you are a doctor in the CDC that goes anywhere or does anything, you're all the Canary unit. Everybody could go in at any point because everybody knows these protocols.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
It's very interesting. So I wanted to ask you about the different elements of pandemic protocol as it relates to the strain and the different characters in it. We've got characters like F and Nora, Fett, Justine Ferrado, Everett Barnes, the mayor, senators from season 1, and so on. All of them are different branches of public servants or the government or are in the public eye. I think I included Fett here because he's still a government worker. Do you feel that these characters act in a way that's actually representative of how government employees would react to this pandemic? I mean, obviously taking into account that they are human beings and human beings have emotions and all of that. But as professionals, Kyle and I have often questioned the way that these characters react, but that's because we don't know. So I want your expert opinion on that.
Sure. Well, first, actually, you hit the nail on the head of something I wanted to cover, which is simply what is public health infrastructure and who all exactly would be involved in controlling a pandemic outbreak on Manhattan or in the greater New York City area. So you would have, and we mentioned this a little bit, either your city, county, state health departments, your Department of Health and Human Services, your labs, your CDC. You'd actually have your local hospitals, emergency departments, clinics, doctors' offices, and any other providers You'd obviously have, as you mentioned, your first responders, but that also includes the Coast Guard, the Border Patrol, the National Guard, the Navy, and other branches as needed. The DoD is heavily involved in that. You would have the VA involved because their medical personnel and their medical facilities would be called upon regardless of whether or not there's veterans involved for being treated. You have NGOs, so you'd have WHO, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders. The Gates Foundation has been getting big into this as well. You would even have, as we talk about the local government, and this is, I had a note to shout out to FET, you would absolutely have pest control because animals are a high vector of transmission, especially rats. So I really like that they included him in this show, and this leads to a second point. Let me finish on who all's involved. So there's even more people involved. So you've got pharma companies involved, of course. Mm-hmm. You have a thing known as group purchasing organizations, or GPOs. So what happens when the pharma company finds and manufactures a vaccine, then the GPOs would buy it from the pharma companies on behalf of the hospitals. Like, even if we have a pandemic outbreak, we just wouldn't deliver things. We would still call up the local hospital and say, how many orders do you want of X vaccine? And then the GPO would call the pharma company and say, okay, what's the best price you can get for me on this? And then wait, we're still not done yet.
Oh gosh.
This is American healthcare, so we have lots of players. We don't have a single system like 98% of the industrialized world. So we have drug distributor companies. So we have entirely separate companies whose sole responsibility it is to go to the pharma companies in their manufacturing plants, pick up the drugs after they've been ordered by GPOs, send them out to their warehouses, and then deliver them to the providers. And then after that, you'd also have the major food supply departments involved. You have the USDA, the FAO, and when things started to get bad and we have to start rationing things and doing emergency stuff, you'd have USAID involved. So just by listing everybody that's involved, you can understand that the inherent complexity and fragmentation of our public health infrastructure creates a lot of friction, a lot of red tape, and a lot of hurdles to doing even basic things like distributing a drug or vaccine.
Interesting.
And,
sorry to cut you off, but is this the process that we kind of saw play out in the previous episode, where he makes this train trip to DC to meet with the important people, and the person he meets with is a pharmacy rep, is a private, right? Someone who works privately, not publicly. Right. He's not meeting with like a subcommittee.
For our listeners, we're referencing the episode Identity. Sorry, continue.
Yes, and that's partially too why I very much love that episode. We even use, in public health, we use the term, are we moving in virus time or are we moving in bureaucracy time? Mm-hmm. Because virus time always moves faster, and in a response like this, you're racing against the clock. So being able to cut out whatever bureaucracy you can and get directly to the company that would manufacture it is absolutely necessary. And what's interesting too is that in reality, in our real world, we rely upon only 3 pharmaceutical companies for the world production of all influenza vaccine.
Wow.
Any single company's setback or problems would result in catastrophe in a response to a pandemic. So, for example, in 2004, when we had the outbreak of H5N1, we had a company called the Chiron Corporation, one of these 3 companies. Its license to manufacture the vaccine was suspended by both the British Medicines and the FDA for sterility failures. So as a result, there was about 23 million fewer doses available during the 04-05 influenza season, which helped spur that outbreak and probably resulted in about, estimates vary because you're just projecting, but anywhere from 20 to 33% more deaths during that season.
Wow.
Because one company couldn't produce as quickly because they had a temporary suspension.
So it sounds like what you're getting at is that the strain often portrays the government as being kind of gridlocked on this issue. Like there's until very recently, there's been kind of a stark inaction by the government, or it's not really doing much, it seems like. But that you think that maybe that is reflecting the layers of bureaucracy that go into all of this?
Well, yes and no. So they've won by indeed this would reflect the bureaucracy, and it's not just bureaucracy. Getting the government, particularly the federal government, to take swift action on anything is incredibly difficult. So, for example, let's just use Ebola, for example. At one point, Obama announced that the U.S. was going to send 3,000 National Guard troops to Africa. And 5 weeks later, it was a big controversy in public health because in 5 weeks, we had only sent 200 people.
Wow.
And it took nearly 2 months to execute, the presidential executive order to get 3,000 troops to Africa. And so it makes sense that there's a slow government response. What the strain has failed to do, which other shows do a much better job at, and they started to do it at the beginning because they had like clocks running down, or like day 1, day 2, things like that, is tell us where we are in the timeline. And I think you all have brought this up before, but it's very confusing not to know whether we're, or to remind yourself we're just 2 weeks in.
Right.
So with Ebola and with other outbreaks, and particularly the anti-vaxxers recently, it totally makes sense that people would be skeptical of vampires out there, and are these videos doctored or not, all that sort of stuff. The skepticism should fade away over time, but you're always going to have these conspiracy theorists, moon landing deniers, Holocaust deniers, things like that are out there. But not knowing where we are makes it really hard. One of the things that I really like, though, that a lot of folks complained about was Fitzwilliam's fun ferry trip to visit his brother.
Right.
It seemed boring to probably 98% of folks out there, but for me it was really interesting. I liked it because what they were showing is one of the very first protocols that you would put up, which is limiting a travel and transit and transportation and checking people as they were going in. And I think that was the entire drawn-out purpose of a way too long segment, but they were showing that this protocol had been put into place, and that this was part of Justine, I think her name is.
Justine Feraldo, yeah.
Yes, the mayor of what's her, the Bronx?
Brooklyn?
She's moved around a few times.
Staten Island.
That's
Staten Island. The mayor of Staten Island. So, this is how we do on the island when she shows the bodies. That was a great scene. But yeah, the entire purpose of that segment was to say, okay, this very first standard protocol has been put into place to limiting the points of entry. So you limit just where people can come and go. You shut down borders. You start to limit where people can come and go. You limit their travel and transportation. And with the exception of the fake ID, in this season, they've been pretty accurate with it.
That was one, like, they've been getting better and better, but I think you're right about, like, we don't really know exactly where we are in time. Like, Kyle and I joked in the last episode that it seemed like it might have taken F 2 days to get to Washington, D.C. We know that it doesn't take 2 days to get to Washington, D.C. But, like, there's all these things that they're slowly starting to put up, but we don't know when we are in the process, where we are in the process, and who's doing what. Do you feel like our government would realistically be reacting faster to these things? And like, do you think that the strain could be portraying more characters like what you were discussing earlier, like more situations like that? Because it seems to be like at a really big loss of those moments.
Absolutely. And I apologize if my dog barks in the background.
That's okay.
I think there's a lot greater opportunity to world build and portray all of these characters that we're talking about, and to portray what the result of the outbreak so far has brought about. Okay, so when when you talk about first responders and how they're reacting, those first responders, particularly in a situation where you not only have a medical disease pandemic outbreak, but a violent outbreak combined with it too, those areas would be also the most hard affected or most strongly hit by a vast amount of death. You saw when Fett went back to his office and everybody was gone and everybody was dead. And the other thing that we don't necessarily give enough credence to is that these initial control measures and protocols, like putting up quarantines, putting up travel restrictions, border closures going into and out of New York, reporting requirements, so requiring people to report if they have symptoms, that sort of thing, isolation recommendations, that has a huge negative effect on the local economy. Mm-hmm. And then therefore a ripple effect on the national and global economy. Now, I'm not just saying, we should have some CNBC guy saying, United States productivity is down 2% this week or something like that. But rather, what that affects is things like the entire global supply chain. It affects food. It affects retail and grocery stores. For example, most grocery and food stores have only 2 to 3 days worth of food in them. You think back to, probably the closest comparison we can make to real life is Katrina. Mm-hmm. With Katrina, there was mass looting, lack of supplies, lack of food, general public disarray. Only 1,800 people died. Okay, mm-hmm. And within 4 days, the entire city of New Orleans descended into absolute chaos. There were mercy killings happening at hospitals. There was a nursing home where 30 patients drowned because they weren't appropriately evacuated. So that sort of chaos in a relatively small microcosm of both number dead and time, compared to what's going on in the strain, shows that we should be seeing much greater public disarray happening. People should be in the streets wearing masks. Mm-hmm. There should be trash piled up, because when you talk about isolation recommendations, stay at home, things like the trash and garbage pickup, public functions, people will stay at home rather than go out and not just risk infection, but in this case, risk murder, robbery, right, all that sort of stuff. $50 for Indian food delivery is a great deal in this scenario. I would take that deal every day, and I would say, how much can you deliver? Because I'm ordering hundreds of dollars worth of food at this point if I don't have anything. So that sort of thing needs to be going on, especially when you compare it to stuff that's happened in real life, like Katrina.
That's so fascinating just to think about, just because, that's one of our biggest complaints, I think, that we've had about the show, is talking about how ridiculous it is that she goes to deliver food when night is falling and vampires can get her and everybody knows what's happening. And there's a lot of situations like that are handled a lot better in the books. I always talk about this, but they're just handled so much better in the books than they have been in the show.
I think the books also avoid writing about a lot of situations like that. And the problem the show is running into is that because it's television, you see everything. You can't just focus on one aspect of a scene. You see the whole scene. And so when there's not trash piled in the streets, and I mean, this is a comment we've made from the very beginning of the show, it's just the chaos isn't there. And so it's really great to hear you say that, because that's been our instinct the whole time, that this is not nearly chaotic enough for the situation that's actually happening.
Right, even in the eclipse scene from season 1, when Gus gets arrested by the cops because he killed what is clearly an infected person, and nobody stops to take a look at the victim and see that they're an infected person. That seems so ludicrous that nobody took that moment to look at that person. Does that? Yeah.
Well, so the one thing that I would defend is and this is where we get into, the show needs to bring us along as to where we are in the timeline, is that just as I mentioned earlier with the truthers, the moon landing Holocaust deniers, people that despite all the amount of science today are anti-vaxxers and we're having measles outbreaks in Disneyland because people aren't vaccinating their children from known diseases that we defeated decades ago. It makes sense to have two things happen. One is just a slow dissemination of information. One of the things that I think is accurate is, I'm speaking from the son of a police officer, the police react by standard operating procedures, very militaristic and very habitual. Okay, so if you hit somebody with your car, you're in operations mode. You're just not thinking. You just go out and you just check on them. You're just not thinking. And yeah, we can shake our head as an audience, but it's one of those things where you're operating on just what you normally do, and it will take a lot to change that. It takes a lot to get police into public health emergency mode and public safety mode than from crime elimination, criminal apprehension mode, and they just see Gus, a criminal, just plugging away, doing my job. Now, and I'm not completely defending it because that I did shake my head at that scene a little bit too. I think it gets to not just the question, is it accurate, but is this what we want to be showing? Is this the story that we want to tell on this show? So I think we all agree that there's a lot of other mini stories that could be told that would be much greater, excitement, much greater world building than necessarily apprehending Gus in a dark alley or talking to Bolivar in a dark alley as a first responder.
Right.
So that's a great point, and I think that we've got to keep that in mind when we're analyzing the way people are behaving. But I think what you said about whether it's what we want to actually see, putting aside the issue of realism or not, is something that we've talked about on the podcast too, that watching the government sort of bury its head in the sand, putting aside whether that's realistic or not, might not be the most compelling television. And so our last question for you is asking you to put aside all the medical and science stuff that you're obviously very well versed in, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on The Strain as a television show. What drew you to the show? Why do you watch the show? Do you like the show? Things like that.
Absolutely. Well, I was undecided on the show until the episode Identity. I think The Strain has hit a really good streak in the past 3 episodes in season 2. What drew me to the show at the very beginning was not just a medical background that I like to see what I work on a daily basis on the screen, but I just grew up on a diet of Tales from the Crypt and Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, Evil Dead, Hammer horror, reading Edgar Allan Poe, things like that. So a Guillermo del Toro story is something that attracts me, and you combine that with the medical aspects, and it seems like a lot of fun. And the thing that I think you've talked about that we really want is we want atmosphere, we want mood, we want great visuals like an army of feelers going through a church and Kelly behind some stained glass windows. We want some supernatural spectacle with campy humor and a strong internal logic that enables us to have that momentary suspension of disbelief. So I don't get so caught up in whether F has his gloves on or whether he has his facial barrier on when he's looking close into the vamps that he's experimenting on. We all don't want whiny kids smashing lab equipment.
Yes.
I got really freaked out in that scene because F has been drinking and he's grabbing his kid. I'm like, oh, please don't turn this into a very special episode of why child abuse is bad. A very special episode of why even in the vampire apocalypse we should use positive reinforcement to discipline our children and not corporal punishment. please don't.
No, I think you're right. Like there are parts where you just have to like look the other way and decide that you don't mind it, and then there's other parts where you kind of have to question it. Like I think for me, you saying that Identity was one of your favorite episodes and it kind of sold you on the shows. For me, I've been waiting for that moment to happen, for F to do something kind of right, and for me to see the government react in a way that I want to see it, in a way that I find acceptable, because up until now it hasn't been acceptable. Like it's just been very upsetting.
Absolutely, and there are so there's a lot of stuff in that episode that they got right that really helped us with that. So for example, people in D.C. asking about what's going on up in New York. So I lived in D.C. during 9/11. I was in a building in Arlington that got evacuated because a plane could potentially get it, and saw the smoke traveling down the Potomac from the Pentagon. And it took 5 days, even though I was supposed to fly out of the city on that morning. It took 5 days to get out, and I had to rent a car from 2 states away, about a 3-hour drive, to find a rental to get out of the city. So that would absolutely happen in this situation, and you would have folks from DC, asking F, like, what is it like up there? Is it really all that bad? Because transportation would be so shut down. Something that they also hit on was, the debate on President being impeached, the phone lines being shut down. The phone lines were overrun in 9/11 too. The cell towers would be overrun. We would also have this very big debate over not just whether the government's doing a good job or not, but we'd have folks like the Stoneheart Group getting in on it and trying to profit from it, and you'd have other corporations just like today. You have some corporations that are profiting from illness, and you'd have other corporations that are profiting from the cure. And so those are the things in Identity that really started to kick it off, to say, okay, they're living in the real world, and F has finally taken his level in badass, so we can root for a competent protagonist. Walder Frey seemed to be the only super competent protagonist up until now. We want Walder Frey to be a badass. We want him to, cut vampires down. We don't need to see, Walder Frey's growth to being a badass 30 years ago, because he wasn't a badass then.
Exactly.
We don't need that.
Yes.
We understand that he's been doing this for a long time, so he is now a badass. Those are things that all help that the strain seem to finally come into its own.
Yes. No,
Absolutely.
I certainly think that season 2, it's sort of figured itself out, and it's figured out the new story that it wants to tell, because it's veering pretty far from its source material. Well, we would like to ask if you have any closing statements before we end the interview.
There's a couple interesting other coincidences. One is that the worms in the strain look very similar to the Ebola virus under a microscope. And maybe I'll just tweet that to you. But if you look at, the Associated Press pics of Ebola, they are little worms. They look very similar. The other thing is that in hospitals today, a growing, an increasingly popular technology for sterilizing equipment, and particularly patients' rooms, which is becoming a huger and huger problem. You're talking about hospital-acquired infections. Is ultraviolet irradiation. And it's also had some recent applications in air and water sanitization too. So if you think about, where the strain intersects between mythos and science, the fact that UV kills bacteria and viruses, and the worms sort of look like Ebola, and these vamps are also killed obviously by UV. And Mr. Palmer created his UV room.
Yes.
Then you've got some science there that they're doing well with.
When did that become popularized? Because the books for the strain, I believe the first one came out in 2009.
So UV irradiation has been used since the 1960s.
Okay.
It just hasn't been applied to hospital rooms until really recently. And by recently, I mean like the last, 8 years. I mean, I give them a pass because there's no way that it would have reached their world by then. It's my job to know about these things when I'm consulting with hospitals, so they get a pass on that. And the really cool thing is in the past couple years, creating air and water purifiers using UV. Which absolutely kills everything, much better than the traditional methods.
That's really interesting to know, especially given the context that it's used in the show.
Yeah, it's certainly better than to see that than to see Palmer create a room to romanticize Coco Marchand with.
Well, it's fascinating because, I mean, hearing about the actual real life prominence of UV as a means of killing infections on a show that very recently established that the sort of traditional means of killing vampires, silver, is completely meaningless in this world, right? That the idea of using silver to kill vampires or crosses or whatever, all of that has no meaning. The only way to actually kill them, other than just shooting them, I guess, is with UV light. So it's kind of a more scientific bent on the whole vampire thing.
Is that the case? I mean, I got that you can kill them just by shooting the living heck out of their head.
Yeah.
But I didn't think that meant that silver doesn't necessarily work anymore. It's like you don't necessarily need silver; these other methods work too.
I think silver is just a hard metal that you can chop them with. You can you can if you cut their head off with an iron sword, I suspect it would work just as well.
I'm gonna strongly disagree because they've had scenes where they've captured a vampire by wrapping them in silver and things like that. So silver has its own effect. But yes, you can decapitate as much as you would like. You can dismember and decapitate, and they will always die.
Or just shoot them with handguns, just not military weaponry, just handguns.
I'm just waiting for Walder Frey to say, it's been a long time since I've seen Valyrian steel.
Yeah. Listen, I'm just waiting for an opportunity to refer to a scene as the Red Wedding on this show, and I need that to happen. Blaire has this mysterious scary scene that she's been waiting for since the pilot. I've been waiting for the Red Wedding, so we both have our hopes and dreams.
It's gonna be like the Red Wedding. It's gonna be so good.
Maybe it'll be the same scene.
Exactly.
Well, I did think about that and this is the sort of humor that I like out of the strain is when in the episode after he had wormed himself, when he's eating the spaghetti there,
Oh yeah.
But he had the wine, so you had the Walder Frey with the wine, and I kept thinking about him drinking the wine while everybody's getting murdered.
I was getting a Lost Boys feel off of that one.
Listen, if vampires start getting killed with crossbows, we'll know something's up.
Well, then we'll be in Buffy and Angel territory, Kyle.
No, we'll be in Game of Thrones, and we're not going any further into Angel territory. We're already too deep down that road.
All right. So, Paul Clark, how can people catch up with you? Do you have Twitter, anything like that?
I'm at Curate Health CEO.
There you go.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you again, Paul. We really appreciate you coming on and offering your expertise on pandemics and how it relates to how it may or may not be realistically portrayed on the strain.
Thank you all very much. Have a great one.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, Paul.